continuing with the reading of Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita, compiled and written by Satsrup Das Goswami. We're on the chapter entitled College, Marriage, and Gandhi's Movement, page 26. One night after his first year of college, Abai had an unusual dream. The deity of Krishna, his father had given him, appeared to Abai, complaining, "Why have you put me away in this box? You should take me out and worship me again." Abai felt sorry that he had neglected his deity, and he resumed his worship of Radha and Krishna at home, despite his assignments. Now, it wasn't only the deity of Krishna, it was Radha Govinda, the two deities together. They were about this big, and when Prabhupada's studies became too strenuous, he put them in the box. And then after this dream, he took them out. He tried to worship them as best as he could, even during his grihastha life. And then he gave these deities to his sister Pishima. Pishima worshipped them in her house. All of her bhoga was offered to them by her and her family members. And then after Srila Prabhupada disappeared and entered Samadhi, Pishima came to live in Mayapur in order to leave her body. So at that time, these original Radha Govinda deities were put on the altar. This was in 1978. At that time in Mayapur, we just had one building. It was the Lotus building. And we only had small Radha Madhav and Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. None of the big deities were there at all. And one Shalagram Shila named Sri Gadadhar. So Radha Govindaji were also placed on the altar with them. Then one night, some Gundas came. They had heard that the deities were made of gold. So they came, they broke into the temple, they stole the big Radharani, they stole the Radha Govinda deities, and they stole the Sri Gadadhar, the shalagram, because it's said that inside each shalagram there's some gold. So none of those deities were ever retrieved. That means unless you have pictures, you won't be able to see these original deities that Prabhupada worshipped that his father gave him. In the class 1 year ahead of Abai was a very spirited nationalist, Subhash Chandra Bhosh. He had been a student at Presidency College, but had been expelled for organizing a student strike against a British professor who had repeatedly abused Indian students. At Scottish churches, Bose appeared to be a serious student. He was secretary of the Philosophy Club and was working cooperatively with Vice Chancellor Urquhart. From Subhash Bose and others, Abai heard talks of Indian independence. He heard the names well-known in his native Bengal: Bipin Chandra Pal, who had fought to repeal the Arms Act; Surendranath Banerjee, who startled the British with his agitation against the 1905 partition of Bengal; Lala Lajpat Rai, and most notably, Mohan Das K. Gandhi. Now this one paragraph we could give a whole class on, but since probably all of you know these names from your own history lessons in school, we'll just give a little summary of who these people are who Abai was being influenced by. Subhash Chandra Bose, he was born in a very influential and wealthy family, Bengali family, in Cuttack, in Orissa, because at that time, Orissa and Bengal, Assam, Bangladesh, they were all one province. And his father was very highly placed in the British rule. He was an advocate, a government pleader. He married at a very young age. His wife, at the age of 14, had her first child, and then she had 14 children. And Subhash Chandra, he was the 9th child and the 6th son. So his father, Janakinath, he insisted that all of his sons get a perfect English education because he was in favor of the British rule. So his older 5 brothers, they all went to, in Cuttack, they went to a British school called the Baptist Mission Protestant School. And there, it was just Europeans and Anglo-Indians and anyone who had to do with the government. And they only taught British subjects: English, Latin, Bible, British geography, British history, nothing whatsoever about India. Purely British school. So this was the type of education that Subhash Chandra received in his childhood. Then his older brothers, because Janakinath, his father, was originally from a little village outside of Calcutta. He used to go every year with his family for the Durga Puja festivals. So the brothers, they all went to Presidency College, which at that time was the topmost college for the upper caste Hindus, part of University of Calcutta. So Subhash wanted to follow his brothers. He also went to Presidency College. And there was one history teacher. His name was Professor Oten. And he was openly antagonistic to the Indian students. He would speak badly against the natives and discriminate against them in his classes. And one day, some of the boys were outside of his class, and Professor Oten came out and he collared the boys and pushed them. So this caused an agitation amongst the students, the college students, to be physically abused by a teacher. Verbally abused is one thing, but physically abused is another. So there was a secret plan made, and some say that Subhash Chandra was the ringleader. While the professor was coming up a staircase one day, the students surrounded him and they beat him with their chappals, and then they ran away. The professor wasn't hurt, but of course the school wanted to know who was behind this and who did it. So one of the college servants saw Subhash Chandra run away, and the rumors all ran around also that he was the ringleader. So he was blamed for this, and he was expelled from Presidency College, which made a big uproar in Calcutta, and it humiliated his family. So for 1 year he couldn't attend the college, but because his father was very influential, through the vice chancellor, whose name was Ashutosh Mukherjee of the University of Calcutta, he was able to get his son put into Scottish Churches College. And it was there, it was just 1 year ahead of Abai, that Abai began hearing about the nationalistic underground organizations that were being made. Now the 3 leaders at that time, they all were born before Prabhupada, 20 to 40 years before Prabhupada. So that means that while Prabhupada was a college student, they were already active in their Swadeshi and Swaraj movement. And that was the 3 leaders, that is Lal, Pal, and Bal, or Lal, Bal, and Pal. Lal is Lala Lajpat Rai. He led the agitation in the Punjab side. In Maharashtra, it was Bal Gangadhar Tilak. And in Bengal, it was Bipin Chandra Pal. So naturally, Prabhupada was more influenced by the activities of Bipin Chandra Pal at that time, who was a social reformer. He wasn't interested in revolution, but he did not agree with the non-cooperation of Mohandas K. Gandhi, who we'll just for short call Mahatma Gandhi. Because Mahatma Gandhi, Prabhupada speaks about him quite frequently as not being effective. Mahatma Gandhi, when he was 22 years old, we heard last week that the British gave some entrance to the Indians by taking the Indian Civil Service examination. They had to go to England to take it, and it was a very tough test. So Gandhiji, he went there, he passed the test as a lawyer, and he came back to India, but he was unsuccessful here to make a practice. So he was asked to go to South Africa to plead on behalf of one Indian there. There for 21 years, he made a family, he had his practice. He was also put in jail there for civil rights because of the apartheid in South Africa. And then he came back to India and he began organizing the Swaraj movement by propagating nationalism amongst the farmers, the peasants, and the poorer classes in India, saying that they shouldn't wear milled clothes, they should only wear khadi, that they hand spin, they shouldn't pay taxes, the land tax, the salt tax. The British had just taken over the whole country. They had forced the farmers to grow what they needed, which was useless products like indigo. Indigo is a blue dye that they would use for their cloth. You can't eat it, you can't do anything with it. It would be grown and taken away to England. And most of the products would be grown just to be taken out of the country. So during the time, because the British ruled for almost 200 years, during that time, during the British Raj, there were famines. When the East Indian Company was running the country, almost every 6 years there was a famine, but these famines, 10 million people would die in one famine. That was the Great Bengal Famine, 1769 to 1770. So this is when the British first took over. Then the Madras Famine, 11 million people died. Now, how can so many people die? That's because the British were taking everything out of India. Nothing was left for the Indians to eat. They were starving to death, practically. Then, because the East India Company had absolutely no interest in the Indian population, they were just here to make money. Then came the Skol famine. Another 11 million people died. Then the Orison famine, 1 million people. The Rajputana, 1.5 million. The Great Famine, 1876 to 78, coming up to when Prabhupada was about to be born. 6 to 10 million people. Then the Great Indian Famine, 1 million. And then finally, this Great Indian Famine was when Prabhupada was born. He was a little child. Finally, the greatest, the one that Prabhupada saw when he was in Grihastha life, was the Bengal Famine. Because the British at that time, they were in the middle of the war with Germany, and they wanted all the men to join the army. So they broke all the fishing boats in Bengal, and they gave no food whatsoever to the people. And that way, something that used to cost 2 annas would suddenly cost 200 rupees. And the people simply starved to death on the streets. So after all of this, the agitation became so great that there were 3 different groups. One were the activists who believed in violence, and that was the Lal, Bal, and Pal. Now, Subhash Chandra Bhosh, he was coming in after these people had already died by being put into jail and dying in jail, died by being beaten during peaceful protests, or the one that Prabhupada most heard about which was Bipin Chandra Pal, he was connected with Aurobindo. So in the last 6 years of his life, he took sannyas. He retired from politics. He was, the next one that we'll read about, that's Surendranath Banerjee, he was a moderate. Now, a moderate believed that they should cooperate with the British, and that way both would get what they need. The Indians would be able to rule their own country, at the same time the British would be able to do their trade. So this is Surendranath Banerjee. And then Mohandas Gandhi, he believed in non-cooperation, and they left the Indian National Congress because they didn't think that non-cooperation would do anything at all. And Prabhupada also agreed with that. He said that the British just laughed at Gandhi. They thought it was a joke because he couldn't do anything. As soon as he would do a satyagraha, then the British would come, just like with this Jallianwala Bagh massacre. So that was Gandhi's first satyagraha. And as a result of that, the people there in Jallianwala Bagh, they were doing a peaceful protest, about 1,500 people. And the new ruler of the British ruler of that time, he closed all of the gates, and he had his soldiers come with machine guns and shoot 1,500 people. 300 died, another 1,200 were injured. So the satyagraha was not working, and therefore the activists, the revolutionaries, they started their own movements. So what Subhash Chandra Bhosh did, after he graduated from Scottish churches with honors in philosophy, he was second in the entire University of Chicago. Well, he saw that this satyagraha wasn't working, and he had a different plan. He pretended to be a Muslim, and he escaped out of India, and he went to Germany. And he made an agreement with Hitler that any Indian prisoners of war that they had, because there were many Indian soldiers in the English army. They thought that if they cooperated with the English, then they would their families would be able to live. So all the prisoners of war were given to Subhash Chandra Bhosh to make his own Indian National Army. And when the soldiers heard that anyone who defected from Britain would be able to join this Indian army, all the soldiers left the British army and came there. Then Japan entered the war in 1941, and Japan had by that time come all the way to Rangoon, which is Burma, and they wanted to come and conquer India also. So Japan and Subhash Chandra, they made a pact that you bring your army, you join with our army, and together we'll attack India. So they came to Singapore, and then they entered through Manipal. In Manipal, they killed all the Japanese soldiers because the Japanese just wanted to kick out the British so they could take over. All the Japanese soldiers were killed, and just the Indian soldiers came and attacked Calcutta. And later we'll read how Prabhupada was there during the bombing. And they were bombing the British district where all the Angrezis lived, because it was segregated at that time. And Prabhupada's wife, she refused to leave Calcutta, so Prabhupada had to be there during the bombing. So these people, of course, in college life, because you're just breaking your ties from your family, and you're learning about different philosophies of life. So this was all making a big impression on Srila Prabhupada. And he was very sympathetic to Gandhi's movement. And Gandhi, he was pushing that we should reject everything English. So Prabhupada decided that because he was getting an English education, we'll hear later, he decided to renounce his degree. Scottish Church's college was strict in forbidding anti-government propaganda, but the students were sympathetic to the cause of home rule. Although there were no open signs of rebellion, students sometimes held nationalistic meetings in secret. When Subhash Chandra Bhosh urged the students to support the Indian independence movement, Abai listened. He liked Bhosh's faith in spirituality, his enthusiasm and determination. Abai wasn't interested in political activity, but the ideals of the independence movement appealed to him. Many Bengali speakers and writers expressed India's drive for independence, Swaraj, as a spiritual movement. For instance, Gandhi, he always carried the Bhagavad-Gita with him, although he never spoke about Krishna. Somehow or other, although Krishna incited Arjuna to fight, Gandhi took out of Bhagavad-Gita nonviolence. So this is why Prabhupada didn't accept, later on, Prabhupada didn't accept Gandhiji's philosophy. For the nationalist, political emancipation was analogous to the soul's liberation from material bondage. So we can understand that. They felt that the British were like Maya, and if they could get liberation from the British, then that would be moksha, Swaraj. Abai was interested in devotional service to Lord Krishna, the absolute truth, a conviction he had imbibed from his father and maintained since his childhood, whereas Indian independence was a temporary relative truth. But some of the leaders of Swaraj, while admitting that the Vedic scriptures were indeed absolute, asserted that the original glory of Indian culture could not shine forth for the world's benefit until India became free from the stigma of foreign rule. The foreigners, they pointed out, blasphemed and castigated the preeminence of India's culture. Now, some very interesting things happened when Srila Prabhupada returned to India to establish Krishna consciousness here. The first was when he was in Calcutta. The niece of Subhash Chandra Bhosh came to see Prabhupada. Her name was Lalita Bhosh. And she said, she compared Prabhupada to her uncle, Subhash Chandra Bhosh. She said that my uncle, he went out of India, he made an army, he brought that army back, and from that army, the Swaraj was victorious. Prabhupada also says, it was because of that army that we got independence. Now, she also said at that time, she said Prabhupada did the same thing. His country wouldn't accept him. He left, he went to the West, he made an army of Vaishnavas and brought those Vaishnavas back here. So she was praising Prabhupada like that. And then because she was also very influential in politics, and she was a close friend of Indira Gandhi. Now, Indira Gandhi met with Srila Prabhupada twice. Prabhupada was in the middle of a tour in America going to all the temples, and then he got a message that Indira Gandhi was willing to see him. So he immediately stopped his tour and rushed back to India to meet her. Now, she was very afraid at that time because they had just assassinated the Bangladeshi prime minister. She was afraid that she was going to get assassinated. So when she met with Srila Prabhupada, she couldn't hear attentively what Prabhupada was asking. We have in Prabhupada's house a little diary that we found in Prabhupada's house. When Prabhupada left this world, he had his most valuable things locked up in his almirah, in his bedroom. You can see that almirah. And when I was given the key and opened it up, I found a very small diary. In that diary, there were about 8 to 10 points. And these were the points that Prabhupada spoke with Indira Gandhi about. Give immigration to 500 foreigners, no meeting in the whole country, prostitution is illegal, all of the ministers had to have half-hour of kirtan every day. So Srila Prabhupada speaking to the Prime Minister of the country. But she couldn't hear it. All she said to him was, please give me your blessings, because she was in great anxiety. But Lalita Bhosh said that actually Indira Gandhi was very impressed by Srila Prabhupada, and she considered him to be a greatly saintly person. So when Prabhupada heard that she was favorable, he immediately called two of his sannyasis, Madhudvisa, Prabhupada used to call him the king of Sankirtan, and Tamal Krishna Maharaj, who was our GBC here in India at the time. He said, now I want you, because the government is becoming favorable at last, he said, now I want you to take buses and vehicles to all the villages in India and spread Krishna consciousness, because now the government won't stop us. Prabhupada was having so much trouble. He said, just like Subhash Chandra Bhosh, his own government, Mahatma Gandhi would not allow Subhash Chandra Bhosh to do anything in his Indian National Congress. That's why he had to go out of the country. So Prabhupada, in the same way, he was trying to reestablish the Vedic culture, but the government in Bombay was fighting Prabhupada. They destroyed our temple in Juhu, and the government in Mayapur, in Nadia, was also fighting against us. They supported the Gundas. Huge group of Gundas came and attacked our temple. And they threw the devotees in jail. And this is how, perhaps some of you know, that Bhakti Raghava Swami, he was severely beaten during that time. He was thrown in jail, and his leg became gangrene, and that's why he only has one leg, because of that. And many other devotees were also very severely beaten. So the government threw the devotees in jail and took the side of the Muslims. And we found out afterwards that the Muslims were incited by Prabhupada's own godbrothers, because they were envious of him. They didn't want him to make a big temple, because they all had their small temples all around Mayapur. So Prabhupada was getting a lot of resistance when he came back to India. But he had faith, just as Subhash Chandra Bose was successful finally. So Prabhupada felt that he would also be successful. And he felt that the way to do that was through the villages. Finally, Gargamuni, he brought vans from Germany. And then Lokanath Swami, he started his village preaching with the bullock carts. This is all Prabhupada's master planning, how to reestablish the Vedic culture again in India. And it wasn't until this, when Lalita Bhosh came and spoke to him, that he had the courage to now begin full-time preaching in India. Abai had felt this also, that the foreigners, they pointed out, blasphemed and castigated the preeminence of India's culture. Abai had felt this also. In his assigned reading in M. Ghosh's England's Work in India, he had encountered the theory that the Vedic scriptures were impure, recent writings, and that India's had been a spiritually backward culture before British rule and the spread of Christianity. There were many theories that before everyone was uncivilized here, and then the Aryans came from Europe, and then the Aryans resettled all of India, and it wasn't until the British came that the Indian people were able to become civilized. This is what they preached. And this, although the writer, M. Ghosh, he was a Bengali, he was flattering the British in this book, England's Work in India. And this was their textbook in college, so that all the college students could understand this philosophy, that the Indians are backwards, And until Christianity came to India, they were uncivilized. Natives, they called them. There were many British insults against these Shastras, such as Abhai's professors trying to discount the law of karma. But if India could gain national freedom, then everyone, not only Indians, but the entire world, could benefit from India's highly evolved Vedic culture. Yes, so this was Prabhupada's dream, and this was the dream of the Swaraj movement. But there were other factors, because we know in India, it's not only the Vedic religion. There are Muslims, there are Sikhs, there are Jains, there are Buddhists, and there are also Anglo-Indians who are Christians. So, yes, the dream was there of Gandhi and of all of the freedom fighters, fighting in Punjab, fighting in Maharashtra, fighting in Bengal. But it wasn't a united country because they were being separated by their different religious beliefs. And the British, they worked against that. They took Bengal and they started to partition it. They said the Muslims will get a part, that was East Bengal, and then there would be West Bengal, and there would be Assam, there would be Orissa. They started to break everything up. And these freedom fighters were very much against this partitioning because they could understand that the British were doing this for political reasons. So Prabhupada was growing up just at this volatile time in India, but he didn't take active part in the freedom fight. But if India could gain national freedom, then everyone, not only Indians, but the entire world could benefit from India's highly evolved Vedic culture. The call to Swaraj, although covert, attracted virtually all the students, and Abhay amongst them. He was especially interested in Gandhi. Gandhi always carried a Bhagavad-Gita. He daily read Lord Krishna's holy words and spoke of being guided by the Gita above all other books. Gandhi's personal habits were pure. He abstained from all intoxication, meat eating, and illicit sex. Now, Prabhupada tells a story about Gandhi, that one woman came to him, and she said, I need your help. My son, he eats too many sweets. So Gandhi said, all right, I'll speak to your son, come back in 2 weeks. So she came back in 2 weeks with her son, and she asked Gandhi, well, why did you make me wait 2 weeks? And he said, well, first I had to give up eating too many sweets. So yes, he was considered a sadhu. He lived simply like a sadhu, yet he seemed to have more integrity than the begging sadhus Abhay had seen so many times. Abhay read his speeches and followed his activities. Maybe Gandhi could carry spirituality into the field of action. Now, Abhay, at this point in his life, he had some hope on Gandhi's satyagraha, on his non-cooperation. The Gita's truth, Gandhi proclaimed, belonged in a most prominent place where the Gita not only could be read, but could work for everyone's freedom. And the symbol of that freedom was Swaraj. Nationalist sympathies at Scottish Churches College remained underground during Abhay's years as a student. It was a prestigious school. A student had to study very seriously to obtain a degree there, and he could then look forward to a fine career. Because we have to remember that the only thing the British were teaching all of the students was as much as they had to know to become their slaves, to become their servants, to either go to England and take the Indian Civil Service exam, and then, as we heard, Prabhuji was here last week, they were called, whoever came back from England, they were called Bilat Fere, Bilad is a name for England, and Feri means one who comes back. When they came back from England, they weren't the same anymore because they considered themselves superior to the Indians who lived in India. So this was the British training. It was a type of brainwashing, propaganda, that once you go to England and you pass this stiff test, then your life is perfect, we'll give you a good career, you can become an assistant magistrate, just like Bhakti-yoga Thakur. That was the highest post that an Indian could have in the British rule. They couldn't become magistrate, they can only become assistant magistrates. To speak openly against British rule and in favor of independence meant to risk being expelled. To lose education and career, only the most rebellious would dare. So the students met undercover and listened to the revolutionary leaders. We want Swaraj. We want independence, our own government, our own schools. So this is the students' underground only. Nobody came forward. Even Subhash Chandra Bhosh, when he was a student at Scottish churches, he didn't come forward. It was only when he left the country that he was able to do his work. Gaur Mahan watched his son with concern. He saw Abai not as one of the hundreds of millions of instruments meant to change India's political destiny, but as his pet son. His first concern was for Abai's welfare. While world events moved across the stage of history, Gaur Mahan concentrated on his son's future as he hoped it would be, and as he had always prayed it would be. He was planning for Abai to become a pure Vaishnava, a devotee of Radharani. He had taught Abai to worship Krishna and be pure in character and had arranged for his education. Now Gaur Mahan thought of getting him married. Next step. According to the Vedic system, a marriage should be carefully arranged by the parents, and it should take place before the girl reaches puberty. Gaur Mahan had gotten his first daughter married in her 9th year, his second daughter at 12 years old, and his third daughter at 11. When his second daughter was going on 12, Rajani, Prabhupada's mother, had said, "I shall go to the river and commit suicide if you don't get her married at once." In the Vedic system, there was no courtship. That means the girl and the boy never met before the arrangement was made. Nor was the couple allowed to live together during the first years of their marriage. So even if they were married at age 9, until the girl attained puberty, she wasn't allowed to live with the husband. She would just feed him, bring him things at festivals, see him, go back to her parents' home. And then when she came of age, she would go half of the year to live with her husband. And half of the year she would come back to live with her parents. The young girl would begin serving her husband by cooking for him at her parents' house and coming before him to serve him his meal, or by taking part in some other formal exchange. Then, as the boy and girl grew to physical maturity, they would become so lovable to one another that they would be inseparable. The girl would naturally remain faithful to her husband, since she would have no association with any other boy as she grew to puberty. And Prabhupada explains this to his disciples, that if a girl was out of her house even one night, no one would marry her. She was considered impure. And this, he said that both for girls and for boys, the first person that they become attached to, they remain attached to for their whole life. So that was why the boys and the girls were married very early and allowed to have some type of exchange, so that they would become attached to each other and never think of any other boy or girl. Gormahan had many friends in Calcutta with eligible young daughters, and for a long time he had been considering a suitable wife for Abai. After careful consultation, he finally chose Radharani Datta, the daughter of a Suvarnavanik family associated with the Maliks. So at this time, also when Prabhupada was in college, I don't know if it's mentioned here, we'll find out. It might be, about the Patel bill. There was absolutely no allowance for marrying outside of your caste. You had to marry within your caste. And there was agitation, an act by an Indian, Mr. Patel, I think it'll come up later, for this intercaste marriage. But you'll see that Gormohan very carefully choosing within the Mullik family someone of their own caste, and it makes sense because the eating, the culture, the way they bring up their children, the way they educate their children, then there would be no discourse. Everyone would, the husband and wife would agree with each other. And because the girl would be so much younger than the boy, so the boy would be better educated and he would be able to tell her what should be done. There would be no fights in that way. Prabhupada gives an example. He said that there are 3 things that you should never take seriously. Aramba. One is if you see clouds in the sky in the morning, it's not going to rain. The other is when 2 goats fight with each other. They'll fight and then the next minute, no more fighting. And the other is the fighting between the husband and the wife. The wife says, I'll kill myself, just like Rajani was saying, I'll kill myself. And he's saying, I'm trying, and they're fighting. But then the next minute, it's over. So this is Aramba. In the beginning, it's very big, but then it's nothing. Radharani was 11 years old. After the meeting between her father and Gormohan, both families agreed upon the marriage. Although Abai was a 3rd-year college student with no income, it was not uncommon for a student to marry. He was 21 years old. And he would have no immediate financial responsibilities. Abai didn't appreciate his father's choice of a wife. He had thought of marrying another girl, but in deference to his father, he put aside his reluctance. For the time being, he was living with his family and she with hers, so his marital responsibilities of supporting a family would not be immediate. First, he had to finish college. So Pishima once told me, she said that Prabhupada dusra biya korbe. That he wanted to do another marriage. So when Prabhupada decided, because he had already picked out the girl he wanted to marry, but in deference to his father, he accepted Radharani Datta, although he wasn't attracted to her at all. But then Gormohan will preach to him, and we'll hear about that. During his 4th year, that's the last year at Scottish churches, Abai began to feel reluctant about accepting his degree. As a sympathizer to the nationalist cause, he preferred national schools and self-government over the British institutions, but he could not see that as yet, no such alternatives existed. There were no Indian schools at that time. They only had the British schools to go to. Gandhi, however, was calling on Indian students to forsake their studies. The foreign-run schools, he said, instilled a slave mentality. They made one no more than a puppet in the hands of the British. Still, a college degree was the basis of a life's career. Abai weighed the choices carefully. Because Mahatma Gandhi was going all over the country, and he was saying, reject everything that's British. the cloth, the taxes, the education, all their laws. So he was saying nonviolent, but when the people did it, the British very, very strictly came down and started to kill people. So the Surendranath Banerjee, he said that Gandhi's principle was just magic. It had no logic. Because whenever he tried to do non-cooperation, the British would just come and stop the protests by killing the people. That's all. So these radicals were not in favor of Gandhi's non-cooperation. But this is what Prabhupada was hearing in his college days. So he began to think that maybe I should do what's right according to Gandhi's message. Gormahan didn't want Abai to do something he would later regret. He had always tried to plan the best for his son. But Abai was 23 now and would have to make his decision for himself. So he was married at 21, 1918. He was born 1896. And then Prabhupada said that he wasn't in favor of the marriage, but one day he was going on just riding his cycle, and Radharani's father captured him and brought him for the marriage. So it wasn't his idea at all. And then Prabhupada gave an example. I explained this in the Hindi class 2 weeks ago. He gave the example of Tulsi Das, because Tulsi Das was also married at a very early age. But he was very attached to his wife. And the system always that you go back to the girl would go back to the father's house for part of the year, at least 6 months out of the year. But every time the father came, Tulsi Das would say, next time, next time, next time. He wouldn't let his wife leave because he was so attached to her. He loved her so much. So finally an arrangement was made, and she left with her father in the morning. And that evening, Tulsi Das came to the father's house to take her home. So, just like husbands and wives, they fight. She said, what kind of a man are you? You're so attached to this skin, you can't live without me? If you were so attached to Ram, then you would become a great devotee. And Tulsi Das was very hurt by this. It hurt him because he said, I loved her so much and she's abusing me like this. So he left and he never came back. And he took her advice. And that was how he wrote Ramcharitra Manas. And Prabhupada says that Ramcharitra Manas is the only real genuine scripture in Hindi. And the Gita Press, they were able to sell millions of these books, that and their Gita. They sold millions of them, and that way Ramcharitra Manasa became very popular through the Gorakhpur Press. We'll hear later how Hanuman Prasad Podar, he was one of Prabhupada's #1 supporters. Also, he wanted to help Prabhupada. He paid for the printing of the first 2 volumes of Srimad Bhagavatam. So he was very supportive. So, he had always tried to plan the best for his son, but Abai was 23 and would have to make this decision for himself. Gormahan thought of the future. The horoscope said that his son would be a great religious preacher at age 70, but Gormahan did not expect to live to see it. Still, he had every reason to accept the horoscope as accurate, and he wanted to prepare Abai. He tried to plan things accordingly, but there was no way to guess what Krishna would do. Everything depended on Krishna, and Krishna was above nationalism, above planning, and the laws of astrology, and above the desires of a modest cloth merchant aspiring to make his son a pure devotee of Srimati Radharani and a preacher of Srimad Bhagavatam. So ultimately, Gormahan, he left the decision to Abai, whether he was going to accept his degree or not. Because Gormahan, as a pure Vaishnava, he understood that everything was in the hands of Krishna. Although Gormahan had always allowed Abai to do whatever he wanted, he had also carefully guided him always on the path he knew was best. Now, without interfering with Abai's decision about college, Gormahan set about to arrange good employment for him, regardless of what else might happen. In 1920, Abai completed his 4th year of college and took the BA exam. Afterwards, with the ordeal of final examinations behind him, he took a short vacation. To fulfill a long-cherished desire, he traveled alone a day's journey by train to Jagannath Puri. So next week we'll hear about Prabhupada's trip to Jagannath Puri and his realizations there. Hare Krishna.